They thought throwing the quiet new girl into a dumpster would be the perfect viral moment. What they didn't realize was that Emma Rodriguez had been training at Iron Fist MMA for 4 years, and she'd just reached her breaking point when Jessica Thompson and her crew cornered her behind the gym building. They expected tears and humiliation. Instead, they got a brutal lesson in why you should never judge someone by their silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain fell steadily on Riverside High School's concrete courtyard, turning the already grim space behind the gym building into something that looked like a crime scene waiting to happen. Emma Rodriguez stood perfectly still, her back pressed against the cold brick wall, watching 3 girls approach her with the kind of predatory confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences. Jessica Thompson led the pack, her perfectly styled blonde hair somehow still pristine despite the drizzle, while Madison Pierce held up her phone with the eager anticipation of someone about to capture their next viral moment. Chen cracked her knuckles, the sound echoing off the empty walls like a warning shot. What none of them knew was that the seemingly helpless girl they'd cornered had spent the last 4 years learning how to defend herself from people exactly like them. Emma's loose hoodie and jeans hid the lean muscle that came from countless hours of training, just as her quiet demeanor masked the discipline and mental toughness that had earned her 3 amateur MMA championships back in Phoenix. Her coach, Tank Sullivan, had always taught her that the most dangerous fighters were the ones who looked like they couldn't hurt a fly. As Jessica stepped closer, Emma realized she was about to prove just how right he was. The dumpster stood like a monument to their cruelty, its green metal surface slick with rain and decorated with the kind of graffiti that told stories of other students who'd found themselves in similar situations. Emma could smell the mixture of rotting food and teenage desperation that seemed to emanate from its depths. This was supposed to be her moment of ultimate humiliation, the incident that would cement her place at the bottom of Riverside High's social hierarchy. Instead, it was about to become the moment when Jessica Thompson learned that some people fight back. Emma's hands remained relaxed at her sides, but every fiber of her being was calculating distances, angles, and the precise moment when she would stop being a victim and start being something else entirely. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last remnants of her old life as the quiet new girl who just wanted to blend in. In approximately 30 seconds, everyone at Riverside High would know exactly who Emma Rodriguez really was, and Jessica Thompson would never be the same. 3 weeks earlier, Emma Rodriguez had walked through the front doors of Riverside High School with the kind of determined anonymity that comes from experience. At 16, she'd already mastered the art of being invisible, a skill that had served her well during the countless moves her family had made throughout her childhood. Her father Carlos worked construction, following jobs across the western states, while her mother Maria found nursing positions wherever they landed. Millbrook, Oregon was supposed to be different though. Carlos had landed a foreman position with a local contractor, promising stability and the chance for Emma to finally finish high school in one place. Emma's athletic build was carefully hidden beneath oversized clothing, a conscious choice that had become second nature over the years. The loose jeans and baggy hoodies weren't just comfort clothes, they were camouflage. Back in Phoenix, she'd made the mistake of letting people see who she really was, and the attention had been overwhelming. Reporters had wanted to interview the teenage girl who was dominating amateur MMA competitions. College scouts had started calling when she was barely 15. The pressure had been suffocating, turning something she loved into something that felt like a burden. When the Rodriguez family decided to move to Oregon, Emma saw it as an opportunity to reinvent herself. She could be just another student, focusing on grades and college applications instead of defending titles and living up to expectations. The plan was simple. Keep her head down, avoid drawing attention, and save the fighting for after school. Hours at whatever local gym she could find. What she hadn't counted on was how difficult it would be to suppress the confidence that came from knowing she could handle herself in any situation. Emma's training had started when she was 12, not because she was particularly interested in fighting, but because her father had watched too many news stories about missing teenagers. Carlos Rodriguez was a practical man who believed in preparation, and he'd decided that his daughter needed to know how to protect herself. What began as basic self-defense classes quickly evolved into something much more serious when Emma discovered she had a natural talent for reading opponents and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. Tank Sullivan had been her first real coach, a former UFC middleweight who'd opened a gym in Phoenix after a career-ending injury. He'd taken one look at Emma's natural stance and the way she moved during her first sparring session and known he was looking at something special. Under his guidance, Emma had developed into a complete fighter, equally dangerous on her feet and on the ground. Her striking was precise and powerful, her grappling was technically sound, and her mental game was stronger than fighters twice. Her age, the move to Oregon had forced Emma to leave Tank behind, but she'd found a new home at Iron Fist MMA, a small gym on the outskirts of Millbrook. The owner, Mike Sullivan, had no relation to her former coach despite sharing the same last name, but he'd quickly recognized Emma's skill level and welcomed her into his tight-knit group of fighters. Training at Iron Fist had become Emma's refuge, the one place where she could be herself without worrying about maintaining her carefully constructed image of harmlessness. At Riverside High, Emma had successfully flown under the radar for exactly 2 weeks before catching the attention of Jessica Thompson. It hadn't been anything dramatic that gave her away, just a moment in gym class when she'd moved with a little too much grace, reacted with reflexes that were a little too sharp. Jessica had noticed, and once Jessica Thompson noticed you, there was no going back to being invisible. Emma's parents had been supportive of her decision to keep a low profile at her new school, understanding their daughter's need for normalcy after years of being in the spotlight. They'd seen how the pressure had affected her in Phoenix, watching their confident daughter gradually become withdrawn and anxious as the expectations mounted. The move to Oregon was as much about giving Emma a fresh start as it was about Carlos's new job opportunity. What Emma's parents didn't fully understand was how difficult it was for their daughter to pretend to be helpless when she knew she wasn't. Every day at Riverside High was an exercise in self-control, watching other students get picked on and not intervening, allowing herself to be pushed around without retaliating. The discipline that had made her a champion fighter was now being used to suppress those very instincts, creating an internal tension that was becoming harder to manage with each passing day. Jessica Thompson ruled Riverside High School with the kind of calculated cruelty that came naturally to someone who'd never faced real consequences for her actions. At 17, she was the undisputed queen of the social hierarchy, a position she'd earned through a combination of natural charisma, family wealth, and a willingness to destroy anyone who threatened her status. Her father owned 3 car dealerships in the Portland area, giving Jessica the kind of financial resources that made her untouchable among her peers. Her mother had been homecoming queen at the same high school 30 years earlier, creating a legacy of privilege that Jessica wore like armor. The power Jessica wielded wasn't just social. It was institutional. She was head cheerleader, class president, and had the kind of pristine academic record that came from teachers who were afraid to give her anything less than an A. Her college applications were already submitted to several Ivy League schools, backed by recommendation letters from administrators who knew better than to cross the Thompson family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica's influence extended beyond the school walls. reaching into the community through her family's charitable foundation and her mother's position on the school board. Madison Pierce had been Jessica's best friend since elementary school, though their relationship was built more on mutual benefit than genuine affection. Madison's family ran a successful social media marketing company, making her the perfect person to document and amplify Jessica's reign of terror. She had over 50,000 followers on various platforms, most of them Riverside High students who tuned in to see who would be the next victim of Jessica's campaigns. Madison's phone was always recording, capturing moments of humiliation that would be edited and posted within hours, turning teenage cruelty into viral content. Ashley Chen completed the trinity of torment, brought into the group during freshman year when Jessica recognized her potential as an enforcer. Ashley was a star volleyball player with a scholarship to Oregon State already locked up, giving her the kind of physical presence that made Jessica's threats credible. She came from a family of overachievers, and the pressure to maintain her athletic and academic performance had created a reservoir of anger that Jessica was expert at directing toward her chosen targets. The three girls had perfected a system of harassment that was as efficient as it was devastating. Jessica would identify potential threats to her social order. Madison would gather intelligence and document the campaign, and Ashley would provide the muscle when psychological warfare wasn't enough. They destroyed the social lives of dozens of students over the years, forcing transfers, causing breakdowns, and creating a culture of fear that kept everyone else in line. Emma Rodriguez had appeared on Jessica's radar during her second week at Riverside High, not because she'd done anything to challenge Jessica's authority, but because she represented something Jessica couldn't tolerate: mystery. Emma didn't fit into any of the established categories that Jessica used to classify her fellow students. She wasn't obviously wealthy or poor, wasn't desperately seeking attention or clearly afraid of it. She moved through the hallways with a kind of quiet confidence that suggested she didn't need Jessica's approval, and that was absolutely unacceptable. Jessica's first attempt to assert dominance had been subtle, the kind of social probing that she used to test new students' defenses. She'd made comments about Emma's clothing, her accent, her family's apparent lack of status in the community. Emma had absorbed these attacks without reaction, neither cowering nor fighting back, maintaining the kind of neutral expression that Jessica found infuriating. Most students either broke down immediately or tried to fight back with words, giving Jessica the opening she needed to escalate. Emma's non-response was throwing off Jessica's carefully calibrated system. The second phase of Jessica's campaign had been more direct. She'd started spreading rumors about Emma's background, suggesting that her family had moved to Oregon to escape some kind of scandal. Madison had created fake social media accounts to post anonymous tips about Emma's supposed secrets, while Ashley had begun the physical intimidation, shoulder-checking Emma in the hallways and stealing her lunch money. Still, Emma had refused to provide the reaction Jessica was looking for, maintaining her composure in a way that was starting to make Jessica look ineffective. Jessica's frustration with Emma had reached a boiling point during a particularly humiliating incident in the cafeteria. She'd orchestrated an elaborate prank involving spilled food and public embarrassment, only to watch Emma clean up the mess with the kind of dignity that somehow made Jessica look petty and cruel. Several students had actually helped Emma, and Jessica had caught a few of them looking at her with something that might have been disapproval. For the first time in her high school career, Jessica Thompson was in danger of losing control of her carefully constructed kingdom. The decision to escalate to physical violence hadn't been made lightly. Jessica understood that crossing that line would bring consequences that even her family's influence might not be able to prevent. But Emma's continued resistance was threatening. Everything Jessica had built, and desperate times called for desperate measures. The plan was simple: corner Emma in an isolated area, humiliate her completely, and make sure Madison captured every moment for posterity. The dumpster behind the gym building had seemed like the perfect location, far enough from the main buildings to avoid immediate interference, but close enough to school property to maintain plausible deniability. What Jessica didn't realize was that Emma Rodriguez had been waiting for exactly this moment. After weeks of enduring harassment and maintaining her facade of helplessness, Emma had finally found the line she wouldn't allow anyone to cross. The quiet new girl who'd been absorbing punishment without complaint was about to show Jessica Thompson what happened when you push the wrong person too far. The first direct confrontation between Emma and Jessica happened on a Tuesday morning in late September, during the chaotic transition between second and third periods. Emma was making her way to a P chemistry when she felt the familiar sensation of being watched. She'd developed an almost supernatural awareness of potential threats during her years of training, and the feeling of predatory eyes following her movements was impossible to ignore. She didn't turn around, didn't alter her pace, but every sense was suddenly hyper-aware of her surroundings. Jessica had been trailing Emma for 3 days, studying her patterns and looking for the perfect moment to make first contact. She'd noticed that Emma always took the same route to chemistry class, passing through the less crowded north hallway where there would be fewer witnesses to whatever happened next. Jessica had positioned herself and her crew strategically, creating what appeared to be a casual encounter, but was actually a carefully orchestrated ambush. The collision was subtle but unmistakably intentional. Jessica stepped directly into Emma's path just as she was rounding the corner, creating a situation where Emma had to choose between stopping completely or making physical contact. Emma chose to stop, her training automatically assessing the threat level and calculating potential responses. Jessica's body language was aggressive but not immediately dangerous, her positioning blocking Emma's path without creating grounds for a self-defense claim. "Oh, sorry," Jessica said with fake sweetness, making no move to step aside. "I didn't see you there. You're Emma, right?" The new girl? The question was rhetorical. Jessica knew exactly who Emma was and had spent considerable time researching her background. Behind Jessica, Madison was already recording, her phone positioned to capture Emma's reaction without being obvious about it. Emma's response was measured and polite, exactly the kind of non-confrontational approach her parents had taught her to use in these situations. "Yes, I'm Emma. Nice to meet you." She attempted to step around Jessica, but found her path blocked by Ashley, who had materialized beside her with the kind of casual intimidation that came from years of practice. "Emma Rodriguez," Jessica continued, drawing out the name like she was tasting something unpleasant. "That's Spanish, right? Are you here legally?" The question was designed to provoke a reaction, to push Emma into either defensive anger or embarrassed submission. Jessica had used similar tactics dozens of times before, always with the same result. Her target would either explode in fury or collapse in humiliation, giving her the opening she needed to establish dominance. Emma's reaction was neither of these things. She simply looked at Jessica with the kind of steady gaze that suggested she was seeing right through the performance to the insecurity beneath. "I'm from Arizona," she said quietly. "My dad got a job here." There was no defensiveness in her voice, no indication that Jessica's provocation had found its mark. The failure of her opening gambit caught Jessica off guard. She'd expected Emma to either lash out or shrink away, not respond with the kind of calm confidence that made Jessica's aggression seem disproportionate. She could feel Madison's camera capturing her moment of uncertainty, and the thought of looking weak in front of her own followers was unbearable. "Arizona," Jessica repeated, her voice taking on a mocking tone. "Well, that explains the fashion sense. I guess they don't have mirrors in the desert." She gestured dismissively at Emma's loose jeans and plain hoodie, the kind of understated clothing that would have been perfectly acceptable anywhere else, but was considered practically invisible at Riverside High. Emma glanced down at her outfit, then back at Jessica with what might have been the hint of a smile. "I'm comfortable," she said simply. The response was so unexpected that Jessica actually took a step back, her carefully rehearsed dominance routine thrown completely off track. Ashley, sensing that Jessica needed backup, moved closer to Emma, using her height advantage to create physical intimidation. "You know, new girl, there are rules here, ways things work. Maybe somebody should teach you about them." Her voice carried the kind of threat that had made dozens of students comply with whatever Jessica wanted, but Emma's posture didn't change at all. Emma looked up at Ashley with the same steady gaze she'd given Jessica, and for a moment, Ashley felt something she hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. There was something in Emma's eyes that suggested she wasn't as helpless as she appeared, something that made Ashley's usual intimidation tactics feel suddenly inadequate. "I'm sure I'll figure it out," Emma said, her voice still perfectly calm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get to class." She moved to step around the group, not aggressively but with the kind of confident movement that suggested she expected them to move aside. Jessica found herself stepping back before she could stop herself, her body responding to some subconscious signal that her conscious mind didn't understand. For a fraction of a second, she felt like prey instead of predator, and the sensation was so alien that it took her breath away. Emma walked past them without hurrying, her stride neither defiant nor submissive, just purposeful. The entire encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it left Jessica feeling like she'd lost something important. Madison was still recording, capturing Jessica's confused expression as she watched Emma disappear around the corner. Ashley was standing with her fists clenched, clearly frustrated that her intimidation tactics had failed so completely. "Did you see that?" Madison whispered, lowering her phone. "She just walked away, like we weren't even there." Jessica's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. No one had ever dismissed her so casually, so completely. Emma's calm confidence had made Jessica's aggressive posturing look foolish and childish. Worse, it had all been captured on video, creating a permanent record of Jessica's failure to establish dominance. "This isn't over," Jessica said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "No one walks away from me. No one." She turned to Madison, her eyes bright with malicious intent. "Start digging. I want to know everything about her. Where she came from, why she's here, what she's hiding. Everyone has secrets, and I'm going to find hers." The first battle in the war between Jessica Thompson and Emma Rodriguez had been fought and lost, though neither of them fully understood what had happened. Jessica had expected to establish her dominance over another helpless victim, but instead had encountered someone who seemed immune to her usual tactics. Emma had successfully avoided escalation while maintaining her dignity, but she'd also painted a target on her back that would only grow larger with each passing day. As Emma sat in chemistry class, taking notes on molecular structures, she was acutely aware that something had changed. The careful balance she'd maintained for weeks was beginning to shift, and she could feel the inevitable confrontation approaching like a storm on the horizon. Part of her was relieved that the pretense was finally over, but another part mourned the loss of the anonymity she'd worked so hard to maintain. The stage was set for a conflict that would transform both girls and everyone around them. Jessica Thompson had never met anyone she couldn't break, and Emma Rodriguez had never met anyone who refused to leave her alone. Something had to give, and when it did, Riverside High School would never be the same. Millbrook, Oregon had the kind of deceptive charm that made newcomers believe they'd found a slice of small-town paradise. The main street was lined with locally owned coffee shops and boutiques, the kind of businesses that thrived on the steady income of families who'd lived in the area for generations. Mount Hood dominated the eastern horizon, its snow-capped peak visible on clear days, while the Columbia River carved its way through the landscape just 20 miles to the north. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, and high school football games drew crowds that filled the entire stadium. Emma had arrived in Millbrook during the final week of August, when the summer heat was beginning to give way. to the cool mornings that would define the Pacific Northwest autumn. The Rodriguez family had driven their rented moving truck through town at sunset, and Emma had pressed her face against the passenger window, taking in the tree-lined streets and well-maintained houses that would become her new world. Everything looked peaceful, almost idyllic, the kind of place where teenagers worried about homework and weekend plans, rather than the complex social warfare that had defined her previous schools. The house her parents had rented was a modest, two-story colonial on Maple Street, with a small front yard and a detached garage that Carlos had immediately claimed as his workshop. Maria had fallen in love with the kitchen, which faced west and caught the afternoon light, while Emma had chosen the upstairs bedroom with windows that looked out over the high school's football field. From her desk, she could see the practice sessions and weekend games, a constant reminder of the social ecosystem she would need to navigate. Riverside High School itself was a study in contradictions, modern enough to have decent technology and updated facilities, but old enough to carry the weight of decades of tradition and established hierarchies. The building had been constructed in the 1970s and renovated twice since then, creating a maze of hallways that connected the original structure to newer wings dedicated to science and athletics. The student body of 1,200 was large enough to offer anonymity, but small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, creating the kind of environment where reputations were built and destroyed with surgical precision. Emma's first day had been a masterclass in strategic invisibility. She'd arrived early, picked up her schedule from the main office, and spent the morning mapping out routes between classrooms that would minimize her exposure to high-traffic areas. She'd chosen a locker in the least popular section of the building, eaten lunch in the library, and spoke only when directly addressed by teachers. By the end of the day, she'd successfully avoided making any impression at all, positive or negative. The social structure at Riverside High was as rigid as any military organization, with clearly defined ranks and territories that governed every aspect of student life. At the top were the athletes and cheerleaders, their status cemented by weekend victories and homecoming court nominations. Below them were the honors students and student government representatives, respected but not revered. The middle tier consisted of the various clubs and activity groups, each with their own internal hierarchies and territorial disputes. At the bottom were the outcasts, the misfits, and the invisible, students who existed in the margins and shadows of the school's social landscape. Emma had assumed she would join the ranks of the invisible, at least temporarily. Her plan was simple: maintain a low profile until she understood the dynamics, then gradually integrate herself into whatever group would accept her, without requiring too much explanation about her background. She'd done this successfully at 3 previous schools, and Millbrook seemed like it would be the easiest transition yet. What Emma hadn't counted on was the efficiency of the school's information network. Within 48 hours of her arrival, someone had identified her father's employer, her mother's position at the local hospital, and the approximate rent on their house. Her academic records had been somehow accessed, revealing her GPA and standardized test scores. Someone had even tracked down her previous address in Phoenix, though they hadn't yet discovered the reason for the family's move. The information gathering wasn't malicious, at least not initially. Riverside High School was simply a place where new students were rare enough to generate curiosity, and Emma's arrival had provided a welcome distraction from the usual late summer boredom. Students who had never spoken to her knew her class schedule, her locker combination, and her preference for eating lunch alone. The attention was benign but thorough, the kind of casual surveillance that small communities specialized in. Emma's second week had been when the scrutiny began to feel less innocent. She'd noticed students whispering when she passed, their conversation stopping abruptly when she came within earshot. Someone had taken photos of her walking to and from school, which had been posted on various social media platforms, with captions speculating about her background and intentions. The pictures weren't flattering, carefully chosen to make her look awkward or suspicious, but they weren't overtly cruel either. The shift from curiosity to hostility had been gradual but unmistakable. Emma's refusal to engage with the social hierarchy had initially been interpreted as shyness, but as days passed without any attempt to integrate, it began to be seen as arrogance. Her academic performance was strong enough to threaten the class rankings. Her appearance was striking enough to draw attention from boys who were supposed to be focused on existing relationships, and her general demeanor suggested a confidence that some students found irritating. Jessica Thompson had been monitoring Emma's integration from the beginning, though not out of any personal interest. As the unofficial guardian of Riverside High's social order, Jessica made it her business to evaluate new students and determine where they fit in the established hierarchy. Most transfers were easy to categorize. Obvious athletes were welcomed into the appropriate circles. Academic achievers were directed toward honors programs, and social climbers were either embraced or rejected based on their usefulness to existing power structures. Emma Rodriguez defied categorization, and that made her dangerous. She wasn't trying to climb the social ladder, which suggested she didn't recognize Jessica's authority. She wasn't obviously inferior in any way, which meant she couldn't be easily dismissed. Most troubling of all, she seemed completely comfortable with her outsider status, as if she didn't need the validation that drove every other student at Riverside High. The first signs of organized opposition had appeared during Emma's third week. Her locker had been jammed with paper towels soaked in energy drinks, creating a sticky mess that took 20 minutes to clean up. Someone had signed her up for every club and activity offered by the school, resulting in a bombardment of emails and meeting invitations that clogged her inbox. Her assigned parking spot had been blocked by deliberately carelessly placed vehicles, forcing her to walk an extra quarter-mile to reach the building. These incidents were too coordinated to be random pranks, but they were also too subtle to warrant official complaints. Emma recognized the tactics from her previous schools, the kind of low-level harassment designed to make a target's life miserable without crossing any lines that would trigger administrative intervention. She'd dealt with similar campaigns before, and she knew that responding directly would only escalate the situation. Emma's strategy was to document everything while maintaining her facade of obliviousness. She photographed her vandalized locker, screenshotted the flood of unwanted emails, and kept a detailed log of incidents that might eventually be needed as evidence. At the same time, she continued to attend classes, complete assignments, and avoid any behavior that could be interpreted as provocative or confrontational. The irony wasn't lost on her. At Iron Fist MMA, she was learning to be more aggressive, more decisive, more willing to take risks and push boundaries. Coach Sullivan was constantly pushing her to be more assertive in her training, to trust her instincts and act on opportunities without hesitation. But at school, she was practicing the opposite skills, learning to be passive, patient, and strategically invisible. The contradiction was becoming harder to maintain with each passing day. Emma's training had given her the confidence to handle herself in almost any situation, but that confidence was being suppressed by her need to avoid attention. She found herself analyzing every interaction, every facial expression, every casual comment for signs of threat or opportunity. The mental energy required to maintain her performance was exhausting, and she was beginning to wonder if the effort was worth it. The breaking point would come soon. Emma could feel it approaching with the same certainty she felt when an opponent was about to make a mistake during sparring. Jessica Thompson was escalating her campaign, testing boundaries and looking for weaknesses. The other students were beginning to choose sides, some sympathizing with Emma's plight, while others enjoyed the entertainment value of watching someone get systematically destroyed. Emma's parents had noticed the change in their daughter's behavior, though they attributed it to the normal stress of adjusting to a new school. She was spending more time in her room, less time talking about her day, and more time at the gym. working out her frustrations on heavy bags and willing sparring partners. They trusted their daughter's judgment and respected her need for privacy, but they were also prepared to intervene if the situation became unmanageable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define Emma's entire high school experience. She could continue to endure the harassment and hope it would eventually fade, or she could choose to fight back and reveal exactly who she really was. Either choice would have consequences, but Emma was beginning to realize that some decisions were inevitable, regardless of how much she wanted to avoid them. The transformation of Jessica Thompson from curious observer to active antagonist had been as methodical as everything else in her perfectly orchestrated life. She'd spent 3 weeks studying Emma Rodriguez, analyzing her routines, her reactions, and her apparent vulnerabilities. What she'd discovered was deeply unsettling. Emma seemed to have no obvious weaknesses, no desperate need for acceptance, no visible cracks in her psychological armor that could be exploited for maximum damage. Jessica's bedroom was a shrine to her own success, with shelves lined with cheerleading trophies, academic awards, and photographs documenting her rise to social prominence. The walls were covered with acceptance letters from prestigious universities, recommendation letters from community leaders, and newspaper clippings celebrating her various achievements. It was the bedroom of someone who had never failed at anything, never been denied anything she truly wanted, and never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through the application of superior resources and strategic thinking. The file Jessica had compiled on Emma Rodriguez was thorough enough to impress a professional investigator. She'd tracked down Emma's academic records from Phoenix, discovering a pattern of strong grades and minimal social involvement across multiple schools. She'd found evidence of the family's frequent moves, Carlos Rodriguez's employment history, and Maria Rodriguez's nursing credentials. What she hadn't found was any explanation for why a seemingly normal middle-class family would uproot themselves so frequently, or why Emma seemed so determined to avoid making friends. The mystery was driving Jessica to distraction. In her experience, everyone had secrets, weaknesses, or desires that could be leveraged for control. She'd built her entire social empire on her ability to read people, to identify what they needed most, and then position herself as either the provider or the obstacle to getting it. Emma's apparent self-sufficiency was not just puzzling. It was threatening to the fundamental assumptions that governed Jessica's world. Madison Pierce had been Jessica's partner in surveillance, using her social media connections to gather intelligence and document Emma's daily routine. Madison's followers had become unwitting participants in the investigation, sharing observations and theories about the mysterious new student. The collective effort had produced a detailed profile of Emma's habits, but it had also generated something unexpected: sympathy. Several students had begun to express concern about Emma's isolation, wondering if she was struggling with depression or family problems. Some had even suggested that someone should make an effort to include her in social activities, to help her feel welcome in her new environment. These voices of compassion were still a minority, but they represented a potential threat to Jessica's narrative of Emma as a deserving target. Ashley Chen had been the first to suggest that direct action might be necessary. Her experience as a volleyball player had taught her that sometimes the best defense was a good offense, and she'd grown frustrated with the passive approach Jessica had been taking. Ashley's solution was characteristically blunt: make Emma's life so miserable that she would either submit to Jessica's authority or transfer to another school. The decision to escalate had been made during a strategy session at Jessica's house, with Madison documenting the conversation for her private archives. The 3 girls had spent an entire Saturday afternoon planning their campaign, identifying Emma's potential vulnerabilities and designing a series of increasingly aggressive interventions. The goal was to break Emma's composure, to force her into a public breakdown that would permanently establish her place in the school's social hierarchy. The initial phases of the campaign had been disappointingly ineffective. Emma's response to locker vandalism had been to clean up the mess without complaint. Her reaction to email harassment had been to quietly unsubscribe from unwanted lists. Her solution to parking problems had been to arrive earlier and walk farther. Every escalation had been met with the same maddening composure, as if Emma were operating from some internal playbook that Jessica couldn't access. The failure of conventional tactics had forced Jessica to consider more creative approaches. She'd begun studying Emma's behavior in different contexts, looking for situations where her guard might be down or her responses might be more predictable. The cafeteria observations had been particularly revealing, showing Emma's preference for eating alone and her tendency to choose seats that provided clear sight lines to all exits. Jessica's analysis had identified several patterns that suggested Emma might have more experience with conflict than her passive behavior indicated. Her situational awareness was unusually acute, her posture was consistently balanced and ready, and her reaction times were faster than average. These observations had led Jessica to a disturbing conclusion. Emma Rodriguez might be deliberately choosing not to respond to provocation, which meant she was capable of responding if she chose to. The possibility that Emma was voluntarily restraining herself rather than being genuinely helpless had transformed Jessica's approach to the conflict. If Emma was choosing to be passive, then the challenge was to find a provocation so severe that choice would be removed from the equation. Jessica needed to create a situation where Emma's true nature would be revealed, regardless of her preferences or planning. The research phase had consumed weeks of Jessica's time, but it had also provided her with a psychological profile that would guide her final assault. Emma valued privacy, dignity, and control. She responded to direct confrontation with calculated calm, suggesting that emotional manipulation might be more effective than physical intimidation. Most importantly, she seemed to have no desire for revenge, which meant she probably wouldn't see Jessica's attacks coming until it was too late to prepare. Madison's role in the final phase would be crucial. Her social media presence would ensure that Emma's humiliation was documented and distributed to the widest possible audience. The viral nature of the planned attack would make it impossible for Emma to recover her reputation, even if she managed to avoid immediate consequences. The digital record would follow her for years, serving as a permanent reminder of her defeat. Ashley's contribution would be more straightforward but equally important. Her athletic training and naturally aggressive personality made her the perfect choice for escalating the conflict from psychological to physical. She would provide the muscle needed to overcome Emma's apparent self-control, creating a situation where Emma would be forced to respond as her true self rather than her carefully constructed persona. The plan that emerged from their collaboration was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Emma would be cornered in an isolated location, humiliated in a way that would destroy her dignity permanently and recorded. In the process to ensure maximum distribution of her defeat, the location would be chosen to minimize the risk of intervention. The timing would be planned to maximize the audience, and the method would be designed to leave no doubt about the outcome. Jessica's confidence in the plan was absolute. She'd never encountered a target who could withstand the kind of coordinated assault she was preparing to launch. Emma's apparent strength was actually a weakness, because it had given her no experience with real defeat. When the moment came, she would crumble like every other student who had tried to resist Jessica's authority. The only variable that concerned Jessica was the timing. Emma's composure seemed to be genuine rather than performed, which suggested she might be more resilient than typical targets. The attack would need to be swift and overwhelming, giving Emma no time to prepare or adapt. Once the process began, there could be no hesitation, no second chances, and no mercy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define both girls' high school careers and beyond. Jessica Thompson was about to discover that some people can't be broken, no matter how much force is applied. Emma Rodriguez was about to learn that sometimes fighting back is the only way to make the fighting stop. The collision between these two worldviews would transform everyone involved and create ripple effects that would be felt long after graduation. The chemistry lab at Riverside High had been recently renovated, its sleek black countertops and modern equipment creating an atmosphere of serious academic pursuit. Emma had always found science classes calming, appreciating the logical progression of experiments and the predictable outcomes that resulted from following established procedures. It was during her 4th week at the school, while she was carefully measuring solutions for a titration experiment, that Jessica Thompson made her first direct move. Emma had been paired with Ryan Cooper for the lab assignment, a quiet junior who reminded her of herself in many ways. Ryan was the kind of student who excelled academically but remained invisible socially, content to focus on his studies and avoid the drama that seemed to consume so many of his peers. He was explaining the proper technique for reading a burette when Emma felt the familiar sensation of being watched. Jessica had positioned herself at the lab station directly behind Emma, ostensibly working on her own experiment, but actually studying Emma's every movement. Madison was at the next station over, her phone discreetly positioned to capture whatever was about to happen. Ashley was across the room, but Emma could feel her attention like a physical weight. The 3 girls had clearly coordinated their positions, creating a triangle of observation that would make any escape route obvious. The attack, when it came, was subtle enough to avoid detection by Mrs. Patterson, the chemistry teacher, who was circulating through the lab checking on student progress. Jessica had apparently spent considerable time planning the incident, choosing a method that would appear accidental while achieving maximum embarrassment for her target. As Emma reached across the lab bench to retrieve a graduated cylinder, Jessica bumped into her from behind, causing Emma to knock over a beaker of distilled water. The liquid spread across the lab bench, soaking Emma's notebook and threatening to damage the electronic balance that sat at the edge of the workspace. Emma's reaction was immediate and precise, her hands moving to contain the spill while her body shifted to protect the expensive equipment. Her movements were fluid and controlled, showing none of the panic that Jessica had expected to provoke. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry," Jessica exclaimed, her voice pitched loud enough to draw attention from neighboring lab stations. "I didn't see you there. Are you okay?" The concern in her voice was perfectly performed, but Emma could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was evaluating the success of her opening gambit. Emma's response was measured and calm, exactly what her training had taught her to do when faced with a deliberate provocation. "It's fine," she said quietly, continuing to mop up the water with paper towels. "Accidents happen." She didn't look at Jessica directly, didn't acknowledge the obvious intent behind the collision, didn't provide any of the emotional reactions that Jessica was clearly seeking. The failed reaction seemed to confuse Jessica, who had expected either anger or humiliation from her target. Emma's composed response made Jessica's elaborate apology seem excessive and suspicious. Mrs. Patterson had noticed a commotion and was approaching their station, her expression concerned but not alarmed. "Everything all right over here?" Mrs. Patterson asked, surveying the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed thousands of teenage dramas played out in academic settings. Emma's calm demeanor and Jessica's overly solicitous behavior clearly registered as unusual, but not necessarily problematic. "Just a small spill," Emma replied, holding up the soggy remains of her notebook. "I can copy the notes from someone else." Her tone was matter-of-fact, showing no distress about the loss of her work or any suspicion about the cause of the accident. Jessica found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to continue her performance of concern, while internally seething about Emma's lack of reaction. "I feel terrible about this," she said, reaching for Emma's ruined notebook. "Let me help you dry this off." Emma's hand moved to intercept Jessica's reach, her fingers wrapping around Jessica's wrist with surprising firmness. The contact lasted only a second, but it was enough to communicate something that made Jessica's eyes widen in surprise. Emma's grip was strong, controlled, and completely confident. It was the grip of someone who knew exactly how to use her hands for more than just academic pursuits. "I've got it," Emma said, releasing Jessica's wrist and returning to her cleanup efforts. "But thank you for offering." The dismissal was polite but final, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that suggested Emma was accustomed to handling her own problems. Jessica rubbed her wrist where Emma had grabbed it, surprised by the strength she'd felt in that brief contact. The sensation was unfamiliar and unsettling, like encountering a domesticated animal that suddenly showed its wild origins. For a moment, Jessica had felt like she was the one being evaluated, studied, and found wanting. The remainder of the lab period passed without incident, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Emma completed her experiment with Ryan's help, her movements showing none of the tension that typically followed direct confrontation. Jessica struggled to focus on her own work, her attention constantly drawn to Emma's calm competence and apparent indifference to the social dynamics that governed everyone else's behavior. Madison had captured the entire encounter on her phone, but the footage was disappointingly mundane. Emma's composed reaction to the spill made Jessica look clumsy and overly dramatic. The brief moment of physical contact was too subtle to be meaningful to viewers who hadn't witnessed it directly. The video would be useless for social media purposes, providing no ammunition for the psychological warfare that Jessica was trying to wage. Ashley had observed the encounter from across the room, her athlete's eye catching details that others missed. Emma's reaction to Jessica's bump had been wrong, somehow. Instead of stumbling or falling, she'd maintained her balance with the kind of unconscious competence that suggested extensive training. Her body mechanics were all wrong for a regular student, showing muscle memory and reflexes that didn't match her academic persona. The three girls regrouped after class, their usual confidence shaken by the encounter. Jessica's first direct attack had not only failed to achieve its intended effect, but had actually revealed something about Emma that made her seem more dangerous rather than more vulnerable. The brief physical contact had left Jessica with the unsettling feeling that she'd just tested herself against someone who was holding back, someone who could have responded very differently if she'd chosen to. "Did you see how she moved?" Ashley asked, her voice betraying a trace of uncertainty that was unusual for her. "When you bumped into her, she didn't even stumble. And the way she grabbed your wrist." She trailed off, unable to articulate what had bothered her about the interaction. Madison was reviewing the footage on her phone, frustrated by its lack of dramatic content. "This is useless," she said, scrolling through the brief video. "She just looks normal. Boring, even. There's nothing here we can use." Jessica remained silent, still processing the encounter and what it meant for her campaign against Emma. The physical contact had been brief, but it had conveyed information that Jessica was still trying to understand. Emma's hand had been calloused, her grip trained, her response controlled in a way that suggested she'd been in similar situations before. The realization was disturbing because it implied that Emma's passivity was a choice rather than a natural state. The failure of the chemistry lab incident forced Jessica to reconsider her approach to the Emma problem. Conventional intimidation tactics were clearly ineffective, and direct confrontation seemed to reveal more about Emma's capabilities than her vulnerabilities. Jessica would need to be more creative, more subtle, and more patient if she wanted to achieve her goals. The escalation was inevitable now. Both girls understood that. Jessica's attack had failed, but it had also served notice that the conflict was entering a new phase. Emma's restrained response had been a form of communication, a way of indicating that she understood the rules of the game, but was choosing not to play by them. The question was whether Jessica would accept this rejection of her authority, or whether she would continue to escalate until one of them was forced to show their true nature. Emma walked to her next class with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout the encounter, but internally she was calculating and preparing. The chemistry lab incident had been a test, both of her resolve and her capabilities. She'd passed the test, but she'd also revealed more about herself than she'd intended. The next encounter would be different. She could feel it. Jessica Thompson was not the type to accept defeat gracefully, and Emma was beginning to realize that her careful strategy of avoidance might not be sustainable much longer. The drive home from Iron Fist MMA took Emma through the older section of Millbrook, where oak trees lined the streets and Victorian houses sat on large lots that spoke of a more prosperous past. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Emma rolled down her car windows to let the cool breeze wash away the heat and intensity of her training session. She'd spent 2 hours working on her ground game with Coach Sullivan, practicing the kind of submission holds that could end a fight in seconds if applied correctly. Carlos Rodriguez was already home when Emma pulled into the driveway, his work truck parked at an angle that suggested he'd been in a hurry to get inside. The smell of Maria's cooking drifted from the kitchen windows, carrying the familiar scents of cumin and garlic that made their rented house feel like home. Emma grabbed her gym bag from the back seat and headed for the side door, mentally preparing for the conversation she knew was coming. Her parents had been watching her carefully for the past week, noting the subtle changes in her behavior that indicated stress. Emma had become quieter during family meals, more withdrawn in her room, and more intense during her training sessions. Maria had found her daughter's ruined chemistry notebook in the trash and had asked gentle questions about school that Emma had deflected with non-committal answers. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, with Maria stirring a pot of pozole while Carlos sat at the table reviewing construction blueprints. They looked up when Emma entered, their expressions carrying the kind of parental concern that was both comforting and uncomfortable. Emma kissed her mother's cheek and squeezed her father's shoulder, maintaining the routine of normal family interaction while preparing for the conversation that was clearly inevitable. "How was training?" Carlos asked, his tone casual but his eyes alert. He'd been the one to start Emma on her martial arts journey, and he understood better than anyone what her increased intensity at the gym might indicate. "Good," Emma replied, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. "Coach Sullivan thinks I'm ready to compete again, if I want to." The statement was true but incomplete, focusing on the positive aspects of her training while avoiding the reasons why she might need to compete. Maria set down her wooden spoon and turned to face her daughter directly. "Mia, you've been different lately, more quiet, more tense. Is everything okay at school?" The question was gentle but persistent, carrying the kind of maternal intuition that could see through carefully constructed facades. Emma had been preparing for this conversation for days, rehearsing responses that would reassure her parents without revealing the full extent of her problems at Riverside High. She understood their concern and appreciated their support, but she also knew that involving them would only complicate an already difficult situation. "School is fine," Emma said, meeting her mother's eyes with the kind of direct gaze that suggested honesty. "It's just an adjustment, you know. New place, new people, new routines. I'm handling it." The words were carefully chosen to acknowledge their concerns while maintaining her independence. Carlos leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands folded in front of him. "You know, when I was your age, I thought I had to handle everything myself. Thought asking for help was a sign of weakness." His voice carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned through trial and error. "Took me a long time to understand that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let other people help you." The comment was clearly directed at Emma's situation, though he was careful not to make it too obvious. Carlos had taught his daughter to be self-reliant, to trust her own judgment, and to handle her own problems. But he'd also taught her that family was supposed to be a source of strength, not something to be protected from difficult truths. Emma appreciated her father's wisdom, But she also understood the complexities of her situation in ways that her parents couldn't. They'd moved to Millbrook to give her a fresh start, to escape the pressure and attention that had made her previous life so difficult. Admitting that she was having problems would feel like failing them, like proving that their sacrifice had been pointless. "I know, Dad," Emma said quietly. "And I promise, if I need help, I'll ask for it. But right now I'm okay, really." She reached across the table to squeeze his hand, a gesture that was meant to provide reassurance, but also to change the subject. Maria wasn't ready to let the conversation end, her maternal instincts clearly indicating that there was more to the story than Emma was revealing. "You've been spending more time at the gym," she observed. "Training harder, staying later. That usually means you're working through something." The observation was accurate and uncomfortable. Emma's increased training intensity was indeed a response to stress, a way of channeling the frustration and anger that she couldn't express in other contexts. The heavy bag at Iron Fist MMA had absorbed countless punches and kicks that were really meant for Jessica Thompson and her crew. "Training helps me think," Emma said, which was true as far as it went. "Coach Sullivan says that physical discipline leads to mental discipline. I'm just trying to stay focused." The explanation was plausible enough to satisfy casual inquiry, but Emma could see that her parents weren't entirely convinced. Carlos nodded slowly, recognizing the philosophy that had guided his daughter's martial arts education from the beginning. "Coach Sullivan sounds like a smart man. What else does he say about discipline?" The question was a test, Emma realized. Her father was probing to see if she was applying the lessons of her training to her current situation. Carlos had always believed that martial arts were about more than just fighting, that they taught important life skills about patience, timing, and choosing battles wisely. "He says that the best fighters are the ones who don't need to fight," Emma replied, reciting one of Coach Sullivan's favorite maxims. "That real strength comes from knowing when to engage and when to walk away." The words felt hollow as she spoke them, given her current situation at school, but they represented the philosophy she was trying to follow. Maria smiled at her daughter's response, but her expression still carried traces of concern. "That's very wise. But sometimes, Mia, walking away isn't an option. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it's difficult." Her tone was gentle but firm, conveying the kind of maternal wisdom that came from years of watching her daughter navigate complex social situations. The comment struck closer to home than Emma was comfortable with. Her mother's words perfectly captured the dilemma she was facing at Riverside High, the tension between her desire to avoid conflict and her growing realization that some conflicts were unavoidable. Jessica Thompson wasn't the type to be deterred by passive resistance, and Emma was beginning to understand that her strategy of avoidance might be unsustainable. "I know, Mom," Emma said, her voice carrying more emotion than she'd intended. "I know when to stand up for myself." The statement was meant to be reassuring, but it carried an undertone of determination that caught both parents' attention. Carlos and Maria exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that came from 20 years of marriage and parenting. They could both sense that their daughter was preparing for something, that the conversation was moving beyond theoretical discussions of discipline and self-defense. "Emma," Carlos said, his voice taking on the serious tone he used when delivering important life lessons. "You remember what I taught you about fighting, yes? About when it's appropriate and when it's not?" Emma nodded, recalling the countless conversations they'd had about the responsibility that came with her training. Her father had been adamant that her skills were never to be used except in genuine self-defense, that violence was always a last resort to be avoided whenever possible. The lessons had been reinforced by every coach she'd ever trained with, creating a moral framework that governed how she approached conflict. "Fighting is never the goal," Emma recited, repeating the words that had been drilled into her since childhood. "The goal is to protect yourself and others. Fighting is only acceptable when all other options have been exhausted." The phrase had become something of a mantra, a way of ensuring that her capabilities were never misused. "That's right, Carlos," sighed, his approval evident in his tone. "But remember, Mia, you also have the right to defend yourself. If someone puts you in danger, if someone threatens you or tries to hurt you, you don't have to just take it. You have the right to protect yourself, and you have the skills to do it safely." The permission was carefully phrased but unmistakable. Carlos was telling his daughter that, if her situation at school escalated beyond what she could handle through avoidance, she had his support in defending herself. The message was both comforting and troubling, confirming Emma's growing sense that confrontation might be inevitable. Maria moved to stand behind her daughter's chair, her hands resting on Emma's shoulders in a gesture of support and protection. "We trust your judgment, Mia. We've taught you well, and we know you'll make the right decisions. But we also want you to know that you're not alone. Whatever happens, we're here for you." The conversation had provided Emma with the emotional support she needed, while also clarifying the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Her parents trusted her to handle her own problems, but they'd also made it clear that they would support her if she needed to defend herself. The knowledge was both empowering and sobering, removing the last barriers to acknowledging the reality of her situation. That night, Emma lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, processing the day's events and preparing for what might come next. The chemistry lab incident had been a clear escalation, a sign that Jessica Thompson was moving beyond psychological warfare toward more direct confrontation. Emma's restrained response had prevented immediate escalation, but it had also revealed capabilities that might make her seem more threatening rather than more vulnerable. The wisdom of her training and her parents' guidance pointed toward the same conclusion. She should continue to avoid confrontation as long as possible, but she should also be prepared to defend herself if avoidance became impossible. The question was whether Jessica would accept Emma's passive resistance or whether she would continue to escalate until one of them was forced to show their true nature. Emma's training had taught her to read opponents, to anticipate their moves and prepare appropriate responses. Jessica Thompson was becoming predictable in her aggression, following a pattern that suggested she would continue to escalate until she achieved the reaction she was seeking. The confrontation was coming. Emma could feel it approaching with the same certainty she felt when sparring partners were about to make critical mistakes. The only question was whether Emma would be ready when the moment came, whether she would be able to maintain her principles while also protecting herself from someone who clearly had no intention of showing mercy. The answer would determine not just her future at Riverside High, but her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The harassment campaign against Emma Rodriguez entered a new phase during the first week of October, coinciding with Riverside High's homecoming. Preparations. The entire school was buzzing with excitement about the upcoming dance and football game, creating a perfect cover for increasingly aggressive psychological warfare. Jessica Thompson had learned from the chemistry lab failure, adapting her tactics to exploit Emma's apparent desire to remain invisible while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that might reveal more of Emma's hidden capabilities. The escalation began with Emma's social media presence, or rather, the creation of one without her consent. Someone had established fake Instagram and TikTok accounts using Emma's name and photos, posting content designed to make her appear desperate for attention and social acceptance. The posts were crafted with enough authenticity to be believable, but were embarrassing enough to damage her reputation among students who might otherwise be sympathetic to her situation. Madison Pierce had orchestrated the social media campaign with the precision of a professional marketing executive, drawing on her family's business experience to create content that would spread organically through the student body. The fake posts included awkward selfies with captions that made Emma seem needy and overeager, comments on other students' photos that appeared stalkerish and inappropriate, and status updates that painted her as bitter about her outsider status. The genius of the campaign was its subtlety. Students who encountered the fake accounts wouldn't necessarily realize they were fabricated, especially since Emma had no real social media presence to contradict them. The posts were designed to create a negative impression without being obviously malicious, making them difficult to report or challenge through official channels. Emma discovered the fake accounts during study hall, when Ryan Cooper discreetly showed her his phone screen with an expression of confusion and concern. The content was immediately recognizable as fabricated, but Emma could see how other students might accept it as genuine. The photos were real, apparently taken without her knowledge during school hours, but the captions and comments were completely foreign to her actual personality and values. "This isn't me," Emma told Ryan quietly, her voice carrying a controlled anger that was new to their interactions. "Someone is impersonating me online." The admission felt like a defeat, an acknowledgement that her attempts to avoid drama had failed completely. Ryan nodded sympathetically, his programmer's mind already analyzing the technical aspects of the deception. "I figured," he said, scrolling through more of the fabricated content. "The writing style doesn't match how you actually talk, and some of these photos were obviously taken without permission. This is pretty sophisticated harassment." The realization that someone had been photographing her without consent was more disturbing than the fake posts themselves. Emma began mentally reviewing her daily routines, trying to identify when and where the surveillance photos might have been taken. The violation of privacy felt more personal than the previous incidents, crossing a line that transformed the conflict from social warfare to something approaching stalking. Emma's first instinct was to report the fake accounts to both the platforms and the school administration, but Ryan's technical expertise provided a sobering perspective on the limitations of such an approach. The accounts had been created using anonymous email addresses and proxy servers, making them difficult to trace to specific individuals. The photos, while taken without permission, had all been captured in public spaces where Emma had no legal expectation of privacy. The fake social media presence was just the beginning of October's escalation. Emma's locker combination had been somehow discovered and changed, forcing her to cut a class to get assistance from the main office. Her car tires had been deflated during lunch, not slashed but simply emptied of air in a way that created inconvenience without constituting vandalism. Someone had signed her up for dozens of online mailing lists, flooding her personal email with advertisements and spam. Each incident was carefully calibrated to cause maximum frustration while remaining below the threshold that would trigger serious administrative intervention. The perpetrators were clearly experienced in the art of psychological harassment, understanding exactly how far they could push without facing meaningful consequences. Emma found herself spending increasing amounts of mental energy on defensive measures, constantly checking her belongings and surroundings for signs of tampering or surveillance. The cafeteria became a particularly hostile environment during this period. Emma's usual strategy of eating lunch in the library was frustrated by the fake social media posts, which had painted her as antisocial and weird for avoiding normal student activities. She forced herself to eat in the cafeteria, choosing a corner table where she could observe the room while remaining relatively inconspicuous. Jessica Thompson had positioned herself and her crew to maximize Emma's discomfort during lunch periods. They would choose a nearby table and conduct conversations loud enough for Emma to overhear, making comments about weird new students and people who think they're too good for everyone else. The dialogue was clearly scripted for Emma's benefit, designed to create paranoia and social anxiety without constituting direct harassment. The psychological pressure was accompanied by increasingly brazen acts of sabotage. Emma's homework assignments disappeared from her locker, forcing her to explain to teachers why she couldn't submit work that she'd completed. Her gym clothes were soaked with energy drinks, creating sticky messes that required emergency trips to the nurse's office. Someone gained access to her class schedule and began calling in fake absences, creating confusion with teachers and threatening her academic standing. Emma's response to each incident was consistent with the patient, non-confrontational approach she'd maintained since arriving at Riverside High. She documented everything, backed up her computer files, and adapted her routines to minimize vulnerability to sabotage. Her calm reactions to increasingly outrageous provocations began to earn respect from some students who had initially been neutral in the conflict. The unexpected support came primarily from other students who had experienced similar harassment campaigns in previous years. They recognized the tactics being used against Emma and admired her composure under pressure. A small but growing group of allies began offering assistance, from sharing notes when her homework disappeared to providing character witnesses when false reports were made about her behavior. Jessica's frustration with Emma's resilience was becoming obvious to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Her normally perfect composure was showing cracks, her smile becoming strained when Emma's name was mentioned. The failure of conventional intimidation tactics was forcing Jessica to consider more extreme measures, escalating the conflict beyond psychological warfare toward genuinely dangerous territory. The turning point came during a fire drill in mid-October, when Emma found herself separated from the main group of students and surrounded by Jessica's expanded crew. In addition to Madison and Ashley, Jessica had recruited 3 additional girls who were eager to gain favor with the school's social elite. The 6-on-1 confrontation took place in a secluded area behind the gymnasium, away from teachers and security cameras. Emma's training kicked in automatically as she assessed the tactical situation. 6 opponents were too many to handle simultaneously. If they decided to become physical, but their positioning suggested they were more interested in intimidation than actual violence. Emma placed her back against the brick wall of the building, ensuring that she couldn't be surrounded, and waited to see what Jessica had planned. "Having fun at your new school, Emma?" Jessica asked, her voice carrying a sweetness that was completely at odds with the threatening situation she'd created. "I hope you're feeling welcome here. We've all been working so hard to help you adjust." The sarcasm was thick enough to cut, but Emma's response remained measured and calm. "I appreciate everyone's efforts," she said, her tone suggesting genuine gratitude while her body language communicated readiness for whatever might come next. Madison had her phone out, recording the encounter with the enthusiasm of someone documenting a historic moment. The other girls were clearly nervous, uncertain about their roles in the confrontation, but committed to following Jessica's lead. Emma could see the hesitation in their posture, the way they kept glancing at each other for reassurance. "You know," Jessica continued, stepping closer to Emma while staying just outside arm's reach, "some people think you're stuck up. Think you're too good for the rest of us. But I think you're just scared. Scared that if people really got to know you, they'd realize there's nothing special about you at all." The psychological attack was more sophisticated than Jessica's previous attempts, designed to provoke either defensive anger or self-doubt. Emma recognized the tactic from her martial arts training, where opponents often tried to create emotional reactions that would cloud judgment and create openings for attack. "People are entitled to their opinions," Emma replied, maintaining eye contact with Jessica while keeping track of the other girls' positions through peripheral vision. "I'm just here to get an education and graduate. I'm not looking for trouble." The statement was both true and strategic, positioning Emma as the reasonable party while highlighting Jessica's role as the aggressor. It also served as a clear warning that Emma was prepared to defend herself if the situation escalated beyond verbal harassment. Ashley Chen had been unusually quiet during the confrontation, her athlete's instincts apparently warning her that something was wrong with the tactical picture Jessica had created. Emma's positioning, posture, and demeanor didn't match those of a helpless victim, despite her passive responses to previous provocations. Ashley's experience with competitive athletics had taught her to recognize when opponents were more dangerous than they appeared. "Maybe you should find a different school," one of Jessica's recruits suggested, emboldened by the group dynamic but clearly uncertain about the wisdom of direct threats. "Somewhere that's a better fit for your personality." Emma's smile was small but genuine, carrying a confidence that made several of the girls take unconscious steps backward. "I like it here," she said simply. "I think I'll stay." The fire drill was ending, with teachers beginning to call students back into the building. The timing forced Jessica to end the confrontation without achieving the dramatic confrontation she'd been hoping for. Emma's continued composure had once again frustrated Jessica's plans, leaving her with another failed intimidation attempt and growing questions about her target's true nature. As the group dispersed, Emma caught Ashley's eye for a moment, recognizing a fellow athlete's assessment of the situation. Ashley's expression suggested she'd seen something in Emma's demeanor that concerned her, something that didn't match the helpless victim narrative that Jessica had been promoting. The fire drill confrontation marked the end of the psychological warfare phase of Jessica's campaign. Emma's refusal to break under pressure had demonstrated that conventional intimidation tactics were ineffective, forcing Jessica to consider more extreme measures. The next phase would be more dangerous, more public, and more likely to reveal the true nature of both combatants. Emma walked back to class with the same measured pace she'd maintained throughout the encounter, but internally she was processing the shift in dynamics that had just occurred. The gloves were coming off, she could feel it. Jessica Thompson was running out of subtle options and would soon be forced to choose between abandoning her campaign or escalating to genuine violence. The choice, when it came, would define both of their futures and transform the culture of Riverside High School in ways that neither of them could yet imagine. The weight room at Iron Fist MMA occupied the back corner of the converted warehouse that housed Coach Sullivan's gym. Its concrete floors and exposed brick walls creating an atmosphere of serious athletic purpose. Emma had been training there for 6 weeks, gradually earning acceptance from the regular fighters who appreciated her work ethic and natural ability. It was during an unusually intense sparring session with Danny Restrepo, a welterweight with professional aspirations, that her hidden depths began to surface in ways that would soon become impossible to conceal. Danny had been working with Emma on her defensive boxing, practicing combinations that would help her deal with multiple attackers in close quarters. The drill was supposed to be light contact, focused on technique rather than power, but Danny's competitive instincts had gradually increased the intensity until they were trading shots with genuine force. Emma's responses had become increasingly sophisticated, showing footwork and timing that suggested far more experience than her age would normally allow. Coach Sullivan had been watching the session with growing interest, noting the way Emma's movements became more fluid and natural as the pace increased. Her defensive work was textbook perfect, but her counterattacks showed creativity and improvisation that couldn't be taught in a classroom setting. When Danny threw a particularly aggressive combination, Emma's response was lightning quick, slipping the first 2 punches and landing a liver shot that dropped the experienced fighter to one knee. "Time," Sullivan called, stepping into the ring with an expression of surprise and concern. Danny was doubled over, gasping for breath and clearly shaken by the precision of Emma's counter. The shot had been perfectly placed, hitting the exact spot that would cause maximum pain without causing permanent damage. It was the kind of technique that required not just training, but real experience under pressure. Emma immediately moved to check on Danny, her concern genuine and her apology sincere. "I'm sorry," she said, helping him to his feet. "I didn't mean to hit you that hard. Are you okay?" Her worry was evident, showing the kind of compassion that separated true martial artists from mere fighters. Danny waved off her concern, his respect for Emma's abilities clear in his expression. "Don't apologize for good technique," he said, still slightly winded. "That was a perfect shot. I just wasn't expecting that level of precision from someone." "Your age." The comment was both compliment and question, acknowledging Emma's skill while wondering about its origins. Coach Sullivan had coached enough fighters to recognize unusual talent when he saw it, and Emma Rodriguez was displaying abilities that didn't match her stated experience level. Her technique was too refined, her timing too perfect, her understanding of distance and angles too sophisticated for someone who had supposedly been training for only 4 years. After the session, Sullivan asked Emma to stay behind for a conversation that had been building for weeks. The gym was quiet, with most of the evening fighters having completed their training and headed home. Emma sat on a bench beside the ring, toweling sweat from her face while mentally preparing for questions she'd been hoping to avoid. "Emma," Sullivan began, his tone casual but his eyes serious, "you mind telling me a little more about your background? Your technique is unusually advanced for someone with your stated experience." The question was diplomatically phrased, giving Emma room to provide additional information without making her feel like she was being interrogated. Emma had known this conversation was inevitable from the moment she'd first walked into Iron Fist MMA. Her attempts to downplay her abilities had been largely successful with her classmates at Riverside High, but experienced fighters were much harder to fool. Coach Sullivan had clearly noticed discrepancies between her claimed experience and her actual skill level. "I started training when I was 12, Emma said, sticking to the basic facts she'd already shared. "My first coach was pretty demanding. He pushed me harder than most people probably would have." The explanation was true but incomplete, focusing on her introduction to martial arts while avoiding the competitive success that had followed. Sullivan nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the type of intensive training that could produce advanced technique in a relatively short time. "Must have been some coach," he said. "Your fundamentals are solid as a rock. Better than some fighters I've seen with 10 years of experience." The observation was both compliment and probe, encouraging Emma to share more details about her background. Emma appreciated Sullivan's patient approach, but she also understood that her attempts to maintain anonymity were becoming increasingly difficult. Her natural competitiveness was making it harder to hold back during training, and her instinctive responses to pressure were revealing capabilities that didn't match her carefully constructed persona. "Tank Sullivan was his name," Emma said, providing a detail she'd previously withheld. "He used to fight in the UFC, taught me that technique beats strength every time, and that the best fighters are the ones who stay calm under pressure." The mention of her former coach's name was a calculated risk, but Emma hoped it would satisfy Sullivan's curiosity without requiring further revelations. The name recognition was immediate and significant. Tank Sullivan had been a respected middleweight contender before his retirement, known for his technical excellence and ability to develop young talent. Coach Sullivan's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching awe as he processed the implications of Emma's revelation. "Tank Sullivan trained you?" he asked, his voice carrying new respect. "For how long?" The questions were becoming more specific, and Emma realized that her attempt to provide minimal information had actually opened the door to more intensive inquiry. Emma's hesitation was brief but noticeable, suggesting that there was more to the story than she was comfortable sharing. "About 3 years," she said finally. "He moved me pretty quickly through the basics. Side I had natural instincts for reading opponents." The admission was significant, revealing that Emma's training had been with a legitimate professional coach rather than a casual instructor. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that explained Emma's unusual abilities. 3 years of intensive training with a former UFC fighter would produce exactly the kind of technical proficiency and tactical awareness that Emma had been displaying. But it also raised questions about why she was being so secretive about her background and why she seemed so determined to avoid attention. "Did you compete at all?" Sullivan asked, his tone carefully neutral. The question was the logical next step in his inquiry, and Emma's answer would determine whether her secrecy was justified, or whether she was being unnecessarily paranoid about her past. The question struck at the heart of Emma's dilemma. Her competitive record was a matter of public record for anyone who knew where to look, but admitting to it would completely undermine her attempts to maintain a low profile at Riverside High. She could feel herself approaching a decision point that would define her future relationships with both her coach and her classmates. Some, Emma said finally, the understatement so significant that it was almost dishonest. Local tournaments mostly. Nothing too serious. The answer was technically true, but missed the essential facts about her level of success and the attention it had generated. Sullivan's expression suggested he suspected there was more to the story, but he was experienced enough to recognize when a student was uncomfortable sharing personal information. His role was to help Emma improve as a fighter, not to pry into her reasons for seeking anonymity. "Well, whatever your background, you're welcome here," he said, standing and preparing to lock up the gym. "Just remember that hiding your abilities doesn't do anyone any favors. If you're as good as I think you are, you have a responsibility to use those skills responsibly." The comment was more prescient than Sullivan realized, touching on the exact dilemma that Emma was facing at Riverside High School. Her attempts to avoid conflict were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and her training was making it harder to appear helpless when confronted by threats. Emma drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, processing the conversation and its implications for her carefully constructed double life. The incident with Danny had been a reminder that her true abilities were becoming harder to conceal, especially when adrenaline and competitive instincts took over her conscious control. At home, Emma found her parents waiting with expressions of concern that suggested they'd received some kind of disturbing information. Maria was holding her laptop, its screen displaying what appeared to be social media content. Carlos was pacing in the kitchen, his body language indicating barely controlled anger. "Mia," Maria said, her voice tight with worry, "we need to talk about what's happening at school." She turned the laptop screen toward Emma, revealing the fake Instagram account that had been created in her name. The content was even more extensive than Emma had realized, with dozens of posts that painted her as desperate, unstable, and potentially dangerous. Emma's stomach dropped as she realized the full scope of the online harassment campaign. The fake posts weren't just embarrassing. They were creating a narrative that could have serious consequences for her reputation and her family's standing in the community. Someone had invested considerable time and effort in constructing the comprehensive character assassination. "This isn't me," Emma said, the words feeling inadequate to address the scope of the deception. "Someone at school is impersonating me online. I was going to handle it myself, but..." She trailed off, realizing that her attempts to manage the situation independently were no longer sufficient. Carlos stopped pacing and turned to face his daughter directly. "Emma, this is serious. This isn't just teenage drama anymore. Someone is actively trying to damage your reputation and our family's reputation. We need to involve the police and the school administration." The suggestion made Emma's chest tighten with anxiety. Official involvement would mean investigations, interviews, and the kind of attention that she'd been desperately trying to avoid. But the fake social media campaign had escalated beyond anything she could handle independently, and her parents' concern was completely justified. "I know, Dad," Emma said, her voice carrying a resignation that surprised her parents. "I've been trying to handle it quietly, but it's getting worse. I think it's time to stop trying to be invisible." The admission felt like a surrender, but it also carried a sense of relief. Maria closed the laptop and moved to embrace her daughter, her maternal instincts recognizing the stress that Emma had been carrying alone. "You don't have to handle this by yourself, Mia. We're a family, and families face problems together." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Emma providing a full account of the harassment campaign that had been building for weeks. Her parents' anger was directed not at Emma for failing to report the incidents earlier, but at the perpetrators who had been systematically tormenting their daughter, while hiding behind anonymity and plausible deniability. The decision to involve authorities would mark the end of Emma's attempts to resolve the conflict through avoidance and patience. The next phase would be more public, more confrontational, and more likely to reveal capabilities that Emma had been working to keep hidden. The quiet new girl who had wanted nothing more than to blend in was about to discover that some fights choose you, regardless of your preferences. The dumpster behind Riverside High School's gymnasium was a monument to institutional neglect, its green paint peeling to reveal rust stains that streaked down its sides like dried blood. It sat in a corner of the campus that was perpetually shadowed by the building's bulk, creating a pocket of gloom that seemed designed for the kind of confrontation that civilized people preferred to ignore. Emma Rodriguez found herself being herded toward this location on a gray Friday afternoon in late October, when the early onset of Pacific Northwest winter had drained the color from the landscape and filled the air with the promise of rain. Jessica Thompson had orchestrated the final confrontation with the precision of a military campaign, using intelligence gathered over weeks of surveillance to choose the perfect time and place for Emma's ultimate humiliation. The location was isolated enough to prevent immediate intervention by teachers or administrators, but visible enough from certain classroom windows to ensure that the incident would have witnesses. The timing coincided with the end of sixth period, when most students would be transitioning between classes and therefore available to observe the spectacle that Jessica had been planning. Emma had sensed the approaching crisis during her morning classes, noting the excited whispers that stopped abruptly when she approached and the meaningful glances that followed her through the hallways. The fake social media campaign had reached its crescendo the night before, with new posts appearing hourly that painted her as increasingly unstable and potentially dangerous. The psychological warfare had been building toward something, and Emma's training had taught her to recognize when opponents were preparing for a decisive engagement. The trap was sprung during the transition between American history and advanced biology, when Emma found her usual route blocked by a carefully orchestrated accident involving several football players and a maintenance cart. The alternative path she was forced to take led directly past the gymnasium where Jessica and her expanded crew were waiting with the patience of predators who had finally cornered their prey. Madison Pierce was positioned with her phone ready, having promised her followers the kind of viral content that would cement her reputation as the school's premier documenter of social destruction. Ashley Chen had recruited 2 additional volleyball players for backup, creating a force of 6 that would be more than sufficient to overpower a single target. The other participants were newer to Jessica's inner circle, girls who were eager to prove their loyalty and gain status through association with the school's established elite. Emma's first indication of the ambush was the casual way the group had positioned themselves to block her path, their body language suggesting a planned encounter rather than a chance meeting. Her training kicked in automatically, scanning for escape routes while assessing the tactical situation she was facing. The positioning was professional, suggesting that Jessica had learned from previous failures and was taking Emma's capabilities more seriously than before. "Emma," Jessica called out with false enthusiasm, her voice carrying across the empty courtyard like a bell announcing an execution. "Perfect timing. We've been looking for you." The statement was accompanied by a smile that would have seemed friendly to casual observers, but carried undertones of malice that made Emma's nerves sharp with anticipation. Emma's response was measured and calm, despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. "Jessica," she acknowledged, stopping at a distance that would give her room to maneuver if the situation deteriorated. "What can I do for you?" The question was polite, but carried an undertone of wariness that suggested Emma understood the true nature of the encounter. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, with Jessica using every technique she'd perfected over years of social warfare. She began with seemingly innocent questions about Emma's adjustment to the school, gradually building toward more personal and invasive topics. The goal was to provoke an emotional reaction that would justify whatever came next, creating a pretext for escalation that would make Emma appear to be the aggressor. Emma's responses remained frustratingly composed, showing none of the anger or fear that Jessica was trying to generate. Her military bearing and steady eye contact suggested someone who was accustomed to pressure and unlikely to break under. Interrogation. The failure to achieve the desired emotional reaction was clearly frustrating Jessica, whose performance was becoming increasingly strained as her tactics proved ineffective. The turning point came when Jessica made a comment about Emma's family background, using information that could only have been obtained through serious invasion of privacy. The detail was intimate enough to make Emma's composure crack slightly, revealing a flash of anger that Jessica seized upon as justification for escalation. "You know what I think?" Jessica said, stepping closer to Emma while her supporters moved to flank positions. "I think you're not nearly as tough as you pretend to be. I think you're just a scared little girl who's been hiding behind an act this whole time." The provocation was designed to force Emma into either defensive explanation or aggressive response, both of which would serve Jessica's purposes. Emma's reply was quiet, but carried an undertone of steel that made several of the surrounding girls shift nervously. "I think you should be careful about making assumptions about people you don't really know," she said, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious threat developing around her. The warning was clear enough that Chen, with her athlete's instincts for recognizing genuine danger, took an unconscious step backward. Something in Emma's tone suggested that the passive victim they'd been tormenting for weeks might not be as helpless as they'd assumed. But Jessica was too committed to her plan to heed the subtle warning signs that her more experienced enforcer was picking up. "Scared little girls always make threats," Jessica said, her voice rising to ensure that her words would carry to the growing number of students who were beginning to gather at the edges of the courtyard. "But when it comes time to back them up, they always fold." She gestured to her supporters, a signal that had been planned in advance. The physical confrontation began when two of Jessica's recruits moved to grab Emma's arms, apparently planning to physically force her toward the dumpster that had been chosen as the site of her ultimate humiliation. The action crossed the line from psychological harassment to assault, triggering reflexes that Emma had been suppressing for months. Emma's response was swift and decisive, demonstrating capabilities that none of her attackers had anticipated. The first girl who reached for her found her wrist trapped in a grip that was both painful and inescapable, while Emma's other hand moved to control the second attacker's approach. The technique was textbook perfect, showing training that went far beyond anything that could be acquired casually. "Let go of me," Emma said, her voice carrying an authority that stopped the remaining attackers in their tracks. The girl whose wrist she held was beginning to whimper from the pressure being applied to sensitive nerve points, while her companion was struggling unsuccessfully to break free from Emma's defensive position. Jessica's response to this unexpected development was to escalate further, apparently believing that overwhelming numbers would compensate for Emma's superior technique. She gestured frantically to Ashley and the remaining supporters, demanding that they press the attack despite the clear evidence that Emma was far more dangerous than anticipated. The moment when everything changed came when Chen, following Jessica's increasingly frantic commands, attempted to tackle Emma from behind while she was still controlling the other two attackers. Emma's response was automatic, a defensive technique that she'd practiced thousands of times, but had never used in a real confrontation outside of a controlled training environment. Ashley found herself airborne, flipped over Emma's hip with a precision that spoke to years of dedicated training. She landed hard on the concrete, the impact driving the wind from her lungs and leaving her gasping and disoriented. The throw had been perfectly executed, demonstrating not just technique but the kind of timing and spatial awareness that separated trained fighters from casual practitioners. The effect on the remaining attackers was immediate and decisive. The two girls that Emma had been controlling suddenly found themselves released as she stepped back to assess the new tactical situation. They retreated quickly, nursing injured wrists and looking at Emma with expressions of shock and growing fear. The passive victim they'd been planning to humiliate had just demonstrated that she was capable of defending herself with professional level competence. Madison Pierce had captured the entire sequence on her phone, but the footage showed something very different from what she'd expected to record. Instead of documenting Emma's humiliation, she'd filmed the systematic dismantling of Jessica's carefully planned assault. The video would indeed go viral, but not in the way that any of them had anticipated. Jessica Thompson found herself standing alone in front of Emma, her supporters having either been defeated or retreated to safe distances. The confident predator who had initiated the confrontation was now face to face with someone who had revealed capabilities that completely changed the power dynamic between them. For the first time in her high school career, Jessica was genuinely afraid. Emma's demeanor had changed completely during the brief physical confrontation, dropping the passive facade she'd maintained for weeks. Her stance was balanced and ready, her expression alert but calm, her entire bearing suggesting someone who was comfortable with violence and prepared for whatever might come next. The transformation was so complete that she seemed like an entirely different person. "Is this what you wanted?" Emma asked, her voice carrying no anger but a kind of professional curiosity. "Did you really think this was going to end differently?" The questions were directed at Jessica, but audible to the growing crowd of students who had gathered to witness what they'd expected to be a one-sided beatdown. Jessica's response was a mixture of rage and desperation, the fury of someone whose carefully constructed worldview had just been shattered. She'd built her entire identity around the ability to dominate and humiliate others, and Emma's casual demonstration of superior capability had revealed the fundamental weakness underlying all of Jessica's apparent strength. The confrontation might have ended there, with Jessica's authority permanently broken and Emma's true nature revealed to the entire school. But Jessica Thompson was not the type to accept defeat gracefully, especially not in front of an audience that included potential rivals for social dominance. Her next move would be driven by desperation rather than strategy, escalating the conflict beyond anything that either girl had originally intended. The immediate aftermath of the courtyard confrontation unfolded with the surreal quality of a disaster movie, where ordinary people found themselves processing events that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of high school experience. Ashley Chen lay on the concrete, gasping for breath, while Emma Rodriguez stood in the center of a circle of shocked onlookers. Her transformation from victim to victor so complete that several students were questioning whether they'd somehow misidentified the participants in the conflict. Madison Pierce's phone had captured every moment of the encounter, from Jessica's confident initiation of the assault to Emma's methodical dismantling of the attack. The footage was immediately uploaded to multiple social media platforms, where it began accumulating views at a rate that would make it the most watched content in Riverside High School's digital history. But the viral nature of the video was creating problems that none of the participants had anticipated. Emma's secret was now exposed to not just her immediate classmates, but potentially to anyone with access to the internet. The careful anonymity she'd worked to maintain since arriving in Millbrook had been destroyed in less than 3 minutes of amateur videography. Her parents would see the footage, her former coaches would recognize her techniques, and college recruiters would begin asking questions about the martial arts prodigy who had seemingly appeared from nowhere. The first teacher to arrive on the scene was Mr. Park, the history instructor who had been supervising a detention session when the Commotion erupted outside his classroom window. His initial assessment of the situation was complicated by the fact that Emma appeared completely unharmed, while Ashley was still struggling to regain her composure on the ground. The visual evidence suggested that Emma had been the aggressor, despite witness accounts indicating that she'd been defending herself against multiple attackers. Jessica Thompson had retreated to a position near the gymnasium wall, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of her public defeat. The girl who had ruled Riverside High School through intimidation and manipulation was experiencing genuine fear for the first time in her academic career. Emma's demonstration of physical capability had revealed that all of Jessica's power was based on the consent of her victims, and that consent could be withdrawn at any moment. Emma's demeanor in the immediate aftermath was perhaps more unsettling than her performance during the actual confrontation. She showed no signs of adrenaline crash, no visible emotion about what had just occurred, no apparent concern about the consequences she might face for defending herself. Her calm professionalism suggested someone who was accustomed to violence and prepared for whatever administrative or legal ramifications might follow. Mr. Park's attempt to take control of the situation was complicated by his lack of understanding about what had actually transpired. Emma's willingness to cooperate with his instructions contrasted sharply with Jessica's near catatonic state and Ashley's obvious physical distress. The evidence suggested a level of violence that seemed completely inconsistent with Emma's quiet demeanor and academic record. The crowd of student witnesses was buzzing with excitement and confusion, their conversations creating a background noise that made it difficult for Mr. Park to gather coherent accounts of what had happened. The smartphone footage that was already circulating online provided visual evidence of the encounter, but the shaky camera work and poor audio quality left room for multiple interpretations of the sequence of events. Emma's first concern was for Ashley Chen, whose landing had been harder than Emma had intended. She approached the injured athlete with genuine worry, her medical training from years of martial arts competition allowing her to assess Ashley's condition with professional competence. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present. The supposed victim was now providing first aid to her former attacker. "Ashley," Emma said quietly, kneeling beside the girl who had been trying to tackle her moments earlier. "Can you breathe okay? Any pain in your neck or back?" The questions were medically appropriate and delivered with the kind of calm authority that suggested Emma had dealt with similar injuries before. Ashley's response was a mixture of physical pain and psychological confusion. The tackle attempt that had seemed like a good idea when Jessica suggested it had resulted in her being thrown with a precision that spoke to extensive training. She was beginning to understand that Emma Rodriguez was not the helpless target that Jessica had portrayed, but rather someone with capabilities that made her previous restraint seem almost supernatural. The arrival of Principal Mitchell and the school nurse marked the beginning of the official response to the incident, though their initial assessment was complicated by the contradictory evidence they encountered. Emma appeared calm and unharmed, while Ashley was clearly injured and Jessica seemed to be in some kind of emotional shock. The physical evidence suggested that Emma had been the aggressor, but witness accounts indicated that she'd been defending herself against multiple attackers. Emma's cooperation with the investigation was complete and professional, providing a clear account of events while accepting full responsibility for her actions. She made no attempt to minimize what she'd done or to portray herself as a victim, instead focusing on the facts of the confrontation and her decision to defend herself when physically centers. Emma's testimony before the state legislature had been powerful and persuasive, demonstrating that effective anti-bullying measures required more than just policies on paper, but genuine cultural change supported by training, resources, and accountability. The legislation that passed bore Emma's unofficial signature in its emphasis on teaching students to recognize and interrupt patterns of harassment before they escalated to violence. Her insights into the psychological tactics used by bullies had informed training programs that were now being implemented in schools across the Pacific Northwest, creating a ripple effect that would protect thousands of students who would never know Emma's name. Emma's senior year presentation to incoming freshmen had become an annual tradition at Riverside High School, though her message had evolved from a simple account of her experiences to a comprehensive exploration of personal responsibility, community building, and the courage required to create positive change. The presentation was always standing room only, with students handing on every word from someone who had proven that one person's willingness to stand up could transform an entire institution. The most meaningful change, however, was visible in the daily interactions between students who no longer feared walking down hallways or eating lunch alone. The culture of intimidation that had once defined Riverside High School had been replaced by an atmosphere of mutual respect and support that made learning possible for students who had previously spent their energy simply trying to survive each school day. Emma's relationship with Iron Fist MMA had also evolved, as she had taken on increasing responsibility for teaching younger students and helping Coach Sullivan develop curriculum that emphasized character development alongside physical techniques. Her ability to connect with students who were struggling with confidence issues had made her an invaluable mentor for the next generation of martial artists. The gym had become a community center in many ways, hosting workshops on conflict resolution, self-confidence building, and leadership development that attracted participants from throughout the region. Emma's role in developing these programs had given her experience in curriculum design and group facilitation that would serve her well regardless of which career path she ultimately chose. As graduation approached, Emma found herself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought her from anonymous new student to recognized leader in her school and community. The careful plan she had made to avoid attention and conflict had been completely overturned by her refusal to accept victimization, but the results had been far more positive than anything she could have imagined. Her college decision had ultimately been influenced by institutions that valued her complete profile rather than focusing solely on her martial arts achievements. The University of Oregon had offered her a full academic scholarship with the option to continue training with their competitive martial arts program, providing the perfect balance between educational opportunity and athletic development. The choice represented everything that Emma had learned about the importance of refusing to be defined by others' expectations or limitations. She had proven that a quiet teenager could become a powerful advocate for change, that defensive skills were most valuable when used to protect others, and that real strength came from the willingness to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Her parents had supported her college choice enthusiastically, recognizing that their daughter had found her path through her own courage and determination rather than following a script written by others. The family's move to Oregon had been intended to provide Emma with a fresh start, but it had instead given her the opportunity to discover who she really was and what she was capable of accomplishing. The graduation ceremony at Riverside High School took place on a perfect June morning, with families gathering to celebrate not just their children's academic achievements, but the positive transformation that their school community had undergone. Emma's valedictorian speech focused not on her own accomplishments, but on the collective effort required to create lasting change and the responsibility that each graduate carried to continue that work in their future endeavors. The standing ovation that followed her speech was not just recognition of her academic excellence, but acknowledgement of her role in making Riverside High School a place where every student could feel safe, respected, and valued. The quiet girl who had once sat alone in the library had become someone whose influence would be felt long after she walked across the graduation stage. Emma's final training session at Iron Fist MMA was attended by dozens of current and former Students who wanted to honor someone who had shown them that martial arts were about much more than fighting. Coach Sullivan's presentation of a custom black belt embroidered with teacher reflected Emma's evolution from student to mentor, from someone seeking to hide her abilities to someone willing to share them for the benefit of others. The ceremony was emotional for everyone involved, as they recognized that Emma's departure for college marked the end of an era for their community. But her influence would continue through the students she had trained, the policies she had helped create, and the culture of respect and responsibility that she had helped establish. As Emma packed for college that August, she included items that told the story of her transformation, academic awards that reflected her intellectual growth, photographs from the self-defense club that captured the friendship she had formed, and a framed copy of the anti-bullying legislation that bore the influence of her testimony. Each item represented a different aspect of the person she had become through her willingness to face challenges rather than avoid them. The girl who had once defined success as the ability to remain unnoticed was now someone who understood that real achievement came from using your abilities to help others, standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, and refusing to accept that things had to remain the way they had always been. Emma Rodriguez had learned that sometimes the most important fights are the ones you never wanted to have, and that the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from transforming your community into a place where such enemies can no longer thrive. Her story had become proof that one person's courage could indeed change everything, as long as that person was willing to step forward when the moment demanded it. The quiet new girl was gone forever, replaced by a confident young woman who knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. And in her wake, she left a school, a community, and a generation of students who understood that they too had the power to create positive change if they were willing to find the courage to try. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.